The year was 1200, and a chill wind swept through the monasteries and villages of medieval Europe. In a small, secluded abbey in the hills of Italy, a man named Joachim of Fiore was poring over ancient texts, his eyes fixed on the prophecies of the apocalypse. His heart raced with a sense of urgency, for he believed the end of the world was drawing near. But it wasn't just the end, it was the beginning of a new era, one that would be marked by the rise of two groups of spiritual men who would change the course of human history. Joachim envisioned these men as the last great hope for humanity. One group would be preachers, spreading the word of God with tongues of fire. The other would be hermits, living in seclusion and imitating the angels. He found these visions in the book of Revelation, where he saw a man sitting on a white cloud, resembling the Son of Man, and another man emerging from the temple in heaven with a sharp sickle. For Joachim, these figures were not just symbols. They were real living beings who would soon walk the earth. The man on the cloud represented the preachers, those who would perfectly imitate Christ and preach the gospel of the kingdom. The man with the sickle was the hermits, who would live in heaven-like isolation, embodying the life of the angels. Joachim's ideas were not just about the future. They were a reflection of the divine Trinity. He saw the world as a series of three statuses, each interdependent and overlapping, like the circles of a Venn diagram. These statuses were not separate ages, but a continuous, intertwined journey toward perfection. The first status was the age of the Father, the second the age of the Son, and the third the age of the Holy Spirit. Each status was a step closer to the final, spiritual age where the church would reach its ultimate glory. Joachim believed that the world was not just coming to an end, it was transforming. The end of the third status was not the end of the world, but the beginning of a new spiritual existence. He saw the fulfillment of ancient prophecies in the events of his time, like the rise of Saladin, a Muslim ruler who he believed was the sixth Antichrist. This signaled the start of the end times, a period of great tribulation and conflict between good and evil. In Joachim's vision, the Antichrist was not just one person but a series of evil figures, each more dangerous than the last. The seventh Antichrist, Gog, would be the final and most terrifying of all. But Joachim also saw a new holy pope, who would rise to lead the church in its final battle against the forces of darkness. This pope would not replace the existing church, but would help purify it, guiding it to its ultimate destiny. Joachim's ideas were radical, but he was not a heretic. He wrote his works with the blessing of three popes, and always sought to align his teachings with the church's doctrine. He believed in the Roman Church as the true and holy institution that would lead humanity to salvation. His vision of the future was one of hope, not despair, where the church would reach new heights of spiritual perfection. But Joachim's ideas were not without their ambiguities. He spoke of a decline in virtue at the end of each status, but never specified who would be affected or how long it would last. This left room for others to interpret his visions in their own ways, leading to movements that would challenge the very foundations of the church. One such movement was led by a man named Dolcino. Dolcino believed that he and his followers were the spiritual men of the end times, chosen by God to save humanity. He saw himself as the divinely appointed leader of a new order, the apostles, who would lead the world into the final age. Dolcino's interpretation of Joachim's visions was more radical and heretical, but it was also more urgent, for he believed the end was imminent. As the wind howled through the abbey, Joachim knew that his visions would shape the future, for better or for worse. The world was on the brink of a great transformation, and the spiritual men he had foreseen would play a crucial role in what was to come. The end was near, and the battle between good and evil was about to begin. Dolcino, like his predecessor Joachim of Fiore, believed that God had chosen him to reveal the true meaning of history and the prophecies in the Old and New Testaments. He saw himself as a messenger of a new, moral, and apostolic way of life, one that would lead to the final state of perfection before the end of the world. Dolcino believed that this new way of living had been established by Gerard Segarelli, whom he considered a Christ-like figure. Segarelli, according to Dolcino, was an offshoot of God, sent to lead people back to a state of perfection through apostolic poverty and holiness. Dolcino's teachings were deeply influenced by Joachim's apocalyptic ideas, but he had his own unique interpretations. He divided history into 4 stages, or status: each marked by a particular way of life. The first status was the time of the Old Testament fathers, characterized by marriage and reproduction. This was followed by the second status, which began with Christ and his apostles, emphasizing true faith, miracles, poverty, and chastity. Over time, this status declined, leading to the third status, which started with Pope Sylvester I and was marked by wealth and material possessions. However, this materialism eventually led to a spiritual decline, necessitating the rise of monasticism, as represented by Saint Benedict. The fourth and final status, according to Dolcino, was the most important. It was initiated by Gerard Segarelli and represented a return to apostolic poverty and a life free from material possessions. Dolcino believed that this status was the culmination of history, leading directly to the end times. Unlike Joachim, who saw history in terms of a Trinitarian pattern, Dolcino used a system of fours, which he believed better represented the stages of human history. Dolcino saw the Church as having become corrupt and evil, especially during his own time. He identified Pope Boniface VIII as a symbol of this corruption, accusing him of avarice and abuse of spiritual authority. Dolcino believed that the Church would be purged of its evil elements by a last world emperor, whom he identified as Frederick, King of Sicily. This emperor would rise up against the corrupt Church, kill Pope Boniface and other wicked clergy, and establish a new just rule. The emperor was seen as a messianic figure, chosen by God to bring about this purification. Dolcino also predicted the coming of a holy pope, who would be sent by God to help reform the Church from within. This pope would not be chosen by the corrupt cardinals, but would appear miraculously. Together with the last world emperor, the holy pope would lead the Church until the time of the Antichrist and the final battle. Dolcino believed that the outpouring of the Holy Spirit would mark this final status, bringing grace and divine understanding to the spiritual men of the last days. Dolcino's vision of the end times was filled with both hope and violence. He saw the coming of a new, perfect Church, but also the violent purging of the corrupt elements within it. Despite this, his followers were not called to take up arms themselves, but to wait for the divine intervention of the last world emperor and the holy pope. Dolcino's teachings combined a return to the apostolic way of life with a radical apocalyptic vision, setting him apart from other poverty heretics and making his movement unique in the medieval world. In 1304, Fra Dolcino and his followers found themselves on the run. They fled west, away from the authorities and into the mountainous Seizure River Valley, about 50 miles northwest of Milan. This region, known as Valsesia, was a place of rugged beauty and a long history of resistance against both feudal and communal forces. For Dolcino and his order of apostles, Valsesia became a refuge, a place where they could find support and ultimately a last stand. Dolcino was no stranger to the area. Some historians believe Valsesia was his birthplace, and his familiarity with the region made it an ideal hiding spot. The apostles received help from various individuals and groups, including armed support, which they desperately needed as the inquisitors and their armies closed in. The reasons for this support were twofold: the geography of Valsesia and its political and economic conditions. Valsesia is divided into two main parts: Alta Valsesia, High Valsesia, and Bassa Valsesia, Low Valsesia. The lower part, Bassa Valsesia, includes the major cities of Vercelli and Novara, which sit on the flat Lombard plain. These cities were well connected to other urban centers, with easy access to trade routes. Vercelli, in particular, was a bustling hub for trade, especially for those traveling over the St. Bernard Pass into France and Germany. Alta Valsesia, on the other hand, was a world apart. Nestled in the steep, narrow valleys of the mountains, these remote villages were often isolated and difficult to reach. The land here was rugged, with steep mountains to the west and smaller, but equally formidable, mountains to the east. The main town, Varallo, marked the transition from the lower to the upper valley. Beyond Varallo, the villages were small and scattered, with a total population of only about 5,000 people. The economy of Alta Valsesia was simple and rural. Villagers practiced agriculture and animal husbandry, moving their flocks to the alpine pastures in the summer and bringing them back to the villages in the winter. Unlike the cities, where people bought goods at the market, The Valsesians primarily sold their products to get the coins needed for taxes and feudal dues. They had access to what they needed for survival: pastures, forests, and streams, without the restrictions that feudal lords often imposed in other regions. This self-sufficiency and isolation fostered a strong sense of community and independence. The political situation in Valsesia was complex. The region was a mix of large communes, fortified towns controlled by the rural nobility, and isolated villages. The main powers were the rural nobility, the counts of Biandrate, and the communes of Vercelli and Novara. These groups often clashed over issues like feudal rights, communal privileges, and control of the valuable Valsesia territory. The Biandrate, based in their town of Biandrate, controlled vast stretches of land, including many of the villages in Valsesia. Their castles were both a means of domination and a place of refuge during conflicts. The Biandrate's control over Valsesia was not absolute, especially in the remote areas of Alta Valsesia. The villagers here often lived beyond the reach of feudal lords, which allowed them to maintain a level of independence. This independence, combined with the harsh living conditions, created a strong sense of community and resistance to outside authority. When Dolcino and the apostles arrived, they found a population that was poor, communal, and fiercely independent. Dolcino's message of apostolic poverty and resistance to a corrupt church resonated with the Valsesians, who saw their own struggles reflected in the apostles' ideals. The remote and rugged terrain of Alta Valsesia provided a natural fortress, while the villagers' communal lifestyle and resistance to authority offered a supportive environment for the apostles. In the mountains of Valsesia, Dolcino and his followers found not just a place to hide, but a community that shared their vision of a simpler, more just world. The valleys of Valsesia became a sanctuary, a place where the message of the apostles could take root, and where their final stand would be made. The Biandrate family was one of the most powerful in Lombardy, a region in northern Italy, thanks to their close ties with German emperors. These emperors often tried to control Lombardy, a wealthy and strategic area, but mostly failed. However, their alliances with the Biandrate family proved beneficial. In 1140, Emperor Conrad III confirmed the Biandrate's feudal rights over both the plains and valleys, ensuring that no one, from archbishops to commoners, could take these rights away. A decade later, Emperor Frederick I reaffirmed these rights, including control over castles, villages, and even the right to collect taxes. These imperial favors made the Biandrate very powerful, but it also made them unpopular with their subjects, like the Valsesians, and with nearby communes, such as Novara and Vercelli, who wanted those rights for themselves. The Biandrate's alliance with Emperor Frederick Barbarossa against the Lombard League in 1176 backfired when the emperor's army was defeated at the Battle of Legnano. As a result, the Biandrate lost many of their feudal rights to the commune of Vercelli in 1170. They had to cede control of their castles and couldn't build new fortifications without Vercelli's permission. The Biandrate and Vercelli continued to fight for decades, until they signed a peace treaty in 1217. This treaty divided their control over Valsesia, a valley in the region. The Biandrate had to swear fealty to Vercelli and cede their castles, but they were given back the same castles by Vercelli's podesta, Uberto da Sola. The Biandrate also had to give up the right to collect the fodro, a tax for horse fodder and other taxes, and provide military services to Vercelli. In return, Vercelli promised to protect the Biandrate from their enemies. However, the Valsesians, who lived in the valley, didn't like this new arrangement and revolted. The Biandrate and Vercelli worked together to put down the rebellion, but it sparked a series of uprisings that lasted for over 50 years. The conflict became even more complicated when Vercelli and Novara went to war, pulling the Biandrate into the fight. Despite efforts by the Pope and the Emperor to keep Milan from intervening, Novara emerged victorious, and the Biandrate fell under Novara's control. By 1247, Vercelli and the Biandrate had regained some of their power and made new treaties to control Valsesia. However, the Valsesians, with the help of Novara, rebelled again. They declared themselves a universitas, a collective, and used their mountainous terrain to their advantage. The Biandrate and Vercelli struggled to maintain control, especially as the Valsesians gained more support. The situation changed in 1254, when Novara made peace with Vercelli and the Biandrate. Novara stopped supporting the Valsesians, and the Biandrate were allowed to appoint a podesta to govern Valsesia, paid for by the Valsesians. The Biandrate increased taxes and built fortifications, making life harder for the Valsesians. This only led to more rebellion, and the Biandrate and Vercelli found themselves fighting both internal and external enemies, including the powerful Visconti family of Milan. Exhausted by the constant warfare, Vercelli and the Biandrate made a peace deal with Novara, giving them control over Valsesia. In 1275, the Treaty of Gazzano granted Valsesia full independence. The treaty allowed the Valsesians to elect their own podesta, trade freely with Novara, and be free from military service. The Biandrate were banned from Valsesia, and Novara promised to enforce this. For the next 20 years, the Valsesians defended their independence, even when they were excommunicated by the Bishop of Vercelli. They maintained their sovereignty until 1303, when the Guelphs, backed by the Pope, took control of Vercelli and appointed a bishop who tried to reassert feudal control. It was around this time that a man named Dolcino arrived, and the Valsesians found themselves once again at the center of a struggle for freedom. As the sun set on Mount Rubello, the last days of Dolcino and his apostles were drawing to a close. For years, Dolcino and his followers had fled from the relentless pursuit of the Church, seeking refuge in the isolated and rugged lands of Valsesia. The people of Valsesia, tired of being oppressed by the powerful bishops and feudal lords, saw in Dolcino a champion of their own struggles. They welcomed the apostles with open arms, offering them shelter and support. Dolcino's message of equality and apostolic poverty resonated deeply with the poor and the marginalized. He taught that true Christians should live like the apostles of old, sharing all they had and rejecting the corrupt wealth and power of the Church. This message spread quickly, and many flocked to hear Dolcino speak, building a community of believers who were determined to live by their faith, even if it meant facing the wrath of the authorities. However, the Bishop of Vercelli, Raniero Avogadro, saw Dolcino's movement as a threat to his power and the established order. He called for a crusade against the apostles, offering forgiveness of sins to those who would fight against them. The apostles, now cornered on Mount Rubello, faced a desperate situation. They were starving and weakened, but they remained defiant. Dolcino's followers, men and women alike, fought bravely, believing that their struggle was part of a larger battle between good and evil. Despite their initial resistance, the apostles were no match for the well-equipped and determined forces of the Church. In the final battle, the apostles were overwhelmed, and their ranks were decimated. The bodies of the fallen were scattered across the hills and into the Cesara River, turning its waters red with blood. The river was forever known as the River of Carnage. Dolcino, Margherita of Trent, and a few others were captured and taken to Biella, where they were imprisoned. After 2 months, Pope Clement V ordered their execution. Margherita was burned at the stake first, refusing to renounce her faith even as the flames consumed her. Dolcino and Longino of Bergamo were subjected to cruel torture. Their flesh burned and mutilated as they were paraded through the streets. Their deaths were slow and painful, a grotesque spectacle meant to strike fear into the hearts of anyone who dared to challenge the Church. The end of Dolcino and the apostles was a tragic one, but their story left a lasting impact. The people of Valsesia, who had stood by Dolcino, had shown that they would not be easily subdued. Their support for the apostles was not just about religious belief. It was also a stand for their own rights and autonomy. Dolcino's message of apostolic poverty and resistance against corruption continued to inspire those who sought a world where the poor and oppressed could live with dignity and freedom. Even though Dolcino and his followers were gone, their spirit lived on. The struggle for a just and equal society was far from over, and the legacy of the apostles would continue to shape the lives of those who remembered their sacrifice. In the end, Dolcino's story is a reminder that the fight for what is right and true can be both beautiful and painful, but it is a fight worth undertaking.